Welcome to Fort Donelson National Battlefield. During the early Civil War, rivers played an important strategic role in the struggle for the control of western Tennessee. Union Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant had his headquarters in Illinois at Cairo, or Cairo, or Carroll, depending on who's pronouncing it, where the Ohio River joins the Mississippi River. At the start of the war, Kentucky was neutral, but after Confederate General Polk occupied Columbus, Kentucky on the Mississippi, Grant occupied Paducah on the Ohio. At Paducah, the Tennessee River flows south all the way through the state of Tennessee. A little farther upstream from Paducah, the Cumberland River flows southeast to Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, and then curves back into Kentucky. Fort Donelson was built by the Confederates adjacent to the small town of Dover, Tennessee, to prevent Union forces from using the Cumberland River to assault Nashville. Fort Henry was built by the Confederates to deprive Union forces the use of the Tennessee River to move southward into Tennessee. Fort Henry was Grant's first target. He had the support of Flag Officer Andrew Foote and his new ironclad gunboats. Grant started his operation on February 4, 1862. On February 6th, Foote attacked the fort with his gunboats, while Grant's troops marched south toward the fort. Although the Federal gunboats suffered heavy damage and casualties, the fort surrendered to Foote before Grant could arrive. About 2,500 Confederates escaped to Fort Donelson, about 12 miles away to the east. Only the commander and about 100 men surrendered with Fort Henry. Grant then marched his troops toward Fort Donelson. Foote took his gunboats down the Tennessee River to the Ohio and then up the Cumberland River. The site of Fort Henry today is underwater. This is an aerial view of Donelson National Battlefield and its location near Dover. I marked some points of reference for later. This is a detailed map of the battlefield and points of interest. The Visitor Center is the first stop. It had a very nice museum with a variety of exhibits. One exhibit was a cannon barrel with a light in the bottom of the barrel so you could see what was meant by rifling. Rifling made the projectile spin when it exited the barrel of the cannon. That made for greater accuracy. This is a mock-up of an ironclad gunboat. I visited the battlefield in June of 2015. It was a gorgeous day and the woods were in prime condition. This was a Confederate position called Porter's Battery. You can see remnants of the breastworks. The Confederate Monument. It was erected in 1933 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This spot is just inside where the wall of the fort would have stood. This is a map of the fort. The quarters were huts, not tents. Note that the river batteries are outside the fort, down closer to the water. Here is another cannon. Here is a reconstructed log hut. The Confederates built about 400 of them for the fort. The Upper River Battery, the smaller of the two river batteries. The Upper River Battery had two small 32-pounder carronades on either side of a highly effective 6.5-inch rifled cannon. Carronades were usually used on ships. They could fire a heavy shot for short distances, useful for ship-to-ship close actions. Not very useful, though, for river batteries. The large cannon here looks like a Columbia to me. The large cannon sighted down the river. Note what a good vantage point the gun had. See that boat in the distance? Here's a picture I took of the tug pushing barges as it passed the Upper River Battery. I was impressed by the piloting. Those barges looked pretty unwieldy to me, especially going around bends. Another view of two of the guns. An informative exhibit at the Lower River Battery. An observation platform at the Lower River Battery. The Lower River Battery had 8 32-pounders and one 10-inch Columbiad. This exhibit emphasized the importance of rivers and railroads in the Civil War, and thus why Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were so important to the Confederacy. Grant arrived at Fort Donelson on February 13th with about 15,000 troops, about the same number as the defending Confederates had. He immediately attacked the Confederate fortifications and started encircling the Confederate position, which ran from the river batteries around Fort Donelson and circled all the way around Dover. Confederate resistance was stiff, and Grant made little headway. On February 14th, Foote's gunboats arrived and attacked the fort. The Confederate river batteries drove off the gunboats with heavy losses to the Union flotilla. These two guns, 32-pounders, are to the right of the observation platform. A close-up of the gun on the far right. Two more views of the guns in the river as I walked west behind the battery. Looking toward the west end of the lower river battery. A closer view of the west end of the lower river battery. The gun at the far end is a Columbiad. The guns in the river battery had excellent position for repelling vessels coming up the river. I took a walk down in the battery. Here is a reconstructed powder magazine. Walking along in the river battery. On the night of February 14th, the Confederate generals John Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Buckner, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in command respectively, were delighted at the defeat of Union gunboats, but they realized that Grant had enough troops to encircle their position. Once that happened, they would be trapped. Riverborne transportation would be insufficient to evacuate the garrison. There was only one steamer available. So Floyd ordered a fierce surprise attack on Grant's right flank in an effort to break out upriver toward Nashville. Grant, seeing how strong the Confederates were attacking on his right, figured they must have weakened their positions on his left. So he ordered General Charles Smith on his left to attack the Confederates on their right. The attack met initial success but was stopped when Buckner arrived with reinforcements. The heavy fighting on the Confederate right apparently unnerved Floyd, who ordered his troops on his left, after they had had very good success in their breakout attempt, to return to their original positions. Grant quickly retook any lost ground. This is the advanced spot where the Union troops spent the night of February 15th after fighting ended that day. Fights at night were rare in the Civil War. The weather was terrible, cold, wet, rain, and snow, and many men had discarded blankets and overcoats on the march to Fort Donelson because the weather during the march had been so warm. The men slept in the open without fires and waited to resume the fight the next day. But during the night, Buckner told Floyd and Pillow that his men could not withstand another attack by Smith. Floyd handed over command of the fort to Pillow to surrender, but Pillow then handed over command to Buckner to surrender. Floyd used the one steamer at the fort to leave, taking 2 regiments of troops with him. Pillow escaped across the Cumberland River in a small boat. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest, disgusted at Floyd and Pillow, led 700 of his cavalry across Lick Creek and escaped, as perhaps other Confederates might have. The next morning, February 16th, Buckner sent Grant a note asking for terms of surrender. There followed a very famous exchange of notes. Grant said, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted," which was pretty harsh. And then he added in a much-quoted ultimatum, "I propose to move immediately upon your works." That's almost poetic. No bravado, just quiet determination, resolve, and confidence. It's actually a much more chilling threat than if he had said something cocky like, "If you don't surrender immediately, I will launch another attack on you." Buckner knew Grant wasn't bluffing. He surrendered, but he let Grant know he was peeved, to put it mildly, at his former classmate at West Point and his friend in the military. He said the terms were ungenerous and unchivalrous. From then on, Ulysses S. Grant was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, and he suddenly rose from relative obscurity to national renown. Lincoln promoted him to Major General. This is the hotel in which the formal surrender took place. With the fall of both Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, western Tennessee was wide open to advances by Union forces. Nashville, for example, fell to Union troops on February 25th. The Confederate government fled to Memphis, but that city was captured in June of 1862. Usually in the Civil War, defeated armies retreated to fight again another day, but Grant bagged almost an entire army, about 13,000 men. Grant's capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson was the first bright spot in the war for the Union, after the disasters of Bull Run in the east and Wilson's Creek in the west.